Hi guys, there is a saying, man proposes but God disposes. While we were unable to convene Innovate 2021, the Scientific and Planning Committee made the decision to deconstruct and bring all of us the key components of our Innovate conference through virtual platforms. You may have already attended our inaugural Healthcare InnoMatch, where startup companies from different countries pitched their innovations for an opportunity to test bed for adoption by three of Singapore's largest hospitals, Singapore General Hospital, the National University Hospital, and Tan Tock Seng Hospital. Very soon, two CentreStage speakers will deliver their wisdom via masterclasses. Our first masterclass will be taken by Aaron Maniam. He will inspire with new metaphors for a better normal. Now, numerous metaphors have been used around the world like enemy, forest fire, and more recently, our very own PM said, COVID is endemic, not pandemic. The choice of metaphors influences us in powerful ways. I'm sure Aaron will have a lot for us to think about. For the second masterclass, we will be welcoming Ms. Melissa Kui, who will discuss social issues in Singapore as we look ahead to rebuild and reimagine a far more complex world. Finally, COVID-19 has evolved us as a people. I'm using a metaphor, of course. What new actions and behaviors will we now espouse as a people to create a better normal? We do hope, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed, we will bring our global leadership panel again this year to have this very important conversation with all of us. Keep safe, guys, and hope to see all of you physically soon. Bye for now. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you are just as excited as I am in having this conversation with Mr. Aaron Maniam on new metaphors for a better normal, changing how we perceive systems, structures, and selves. But before that, let us get to know our speaker a little intimately. I hope Aaron doesn't mind. Currently, the DS, Deputy Secretary of the Ministry of Communication and Information, Aaron oversees digital economics, digital regulation, digital literacy and access, and public sector broadcasting. In his free time, he writes poetry, facilitates inter-religious dialogues, and teaches at the National University of Singapore Scholars Program. He is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, an Asia 21 Young Leader of the Asia Society, and a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. Today, Aaron will persuade you and me to explore how we can reinvent metaphors we use for the systems that we're in, the structures of our work and organizations, and also ourselves as agents and people. We want you to be part of this conversation, so do post your questions using the Zoom's chat Q&A function, and we'll get to them after Aaron's conversation with us. I vividly recall meeting Aaron for the first time in a seminar organized by the Civil Service College. Now, two things stuck in my mind. One was a term that he used that continues, not just confuse me, inspires and challenges me today. The word that he used was obliquity. Sometimes indirect path triumph direct ones. His other is his choice of drink when he needs to figure his way out. I don't know about you, but when I need to think deeply, and my clinical director will share this with you, I need a stronger drink, I need wine. Aaron's choice of drink, wait for it, Milo. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Aaron Maniam, Deputy Secretary, Ministry of Communication and Information, to inspire us. Aaron, take it away.
David, thank you so much for that extremely kind introduction. The drink is still Milo. Actually, that has not changed very much. Although sometimes I'm not too partial towards a nice herbal tea as well, if on the right sort of day. Thank you so much to the CHI team for the invitation to join you today. I'm so glad that this is happening. Virtual is better than nothing, as they often say, and I'm really happy that we've managed to all persevere through the many challenges and vicissitudes that have come to the program in these earlier iterations. I wanted to say that if I sound slightly raspy and hoarse, to anyone in the audience. It's not your audio, it is me. I just got back from a work trip to Estonia. So I'm actually undergoing SHN at the moment. And I often when I travel, I'll get this slight dry cough that doesn't go away. I promise you it's not COVID-19, or at least the 3 PCR tests that I have done in the last 6 days tell me that it's not COVID-19. They've all been negative. So I'm fine. I just have this slightly raspy voice that I hope you will indulge me in. But other than that, I really am okay. And I'm looking forward very much to sharing with you some thoughts on what metaphors we can adopt to create a better normal for healthcare and also for the systems within which healthcare finds itself operating. So I do have some slides to start us off. I'll go through those first, and then I'm looking forward very much to the discussion as well as the Q&A. Right, so let me start with the first slide. If we can move to the next slide in the deck. Let's just make sure we've got the technical aspects sorted out. Yeah, I wanted to just ask you a quick question, right? If you look at all of these sentences, what is common about them, right? Children blossom into adults. I will defeat his argument. I don't have room for this in my life. Life has cheated me. Scarcity has given birth to a generation of paranoid teenagers, right? These are all very unique sentences, but what's unifying about all of them? Just think about that for a minute. David has already given you a clue, of course, in that he's mentioned that we're talking about metaphors today. So the answer to this lies somewhat in the idea of what is a metaphor. I'll give you a clue for those of you who need a little bit of further help. If we can go to the next slide. The clue lies in, in each of these underlying bits, right? Children blossom. I will defeat his argument. I don't have room for this in my life. Life has cheated me. Scarcity has given birth. So Kelly has suggested in the chat that it's to do with changes. That is part of it, but it's even more fundamental than that. If you look at each of these, right, they are a metaphor, right? Children blossom. The metaphor is that children are like flowers, right? They start from a bud and then they bloom into something bigger. I will defeat his argument. The arguments here are a battle. They're a fight. One person defeats the other, right? I don't have room for this in my life. It's all about life being a space, right? I don't have room here. I could have more room or less room, but life is treated as a physical space rather than, you know, a virtual space, which is often where we might end up. Life has cheated me, suggests that there's a game here, right? That there are rules to follow in life, and then life has cheated you, that has flouted those rules in certain ways. And when we say scarcity has given birth, it's as if scarcity is a person, right? It has birthed and created new life along the way. So I bring these up because many of you will be thinking, might have been thinking as you saw the title of the talk, new metaphors for a better normal. It's like, oh no, this is another time when one of those crazy poets is going to come along and tell us that the work of poetry actually applies to everything that we all do. And I do want to say that, but I want to say it because I really do think it's true. All of us use metaphors, not just those of us who write poetry, right? And these metaphors are such a fundamental part of how we perceive the world that sometimes we don't even notice that they're there, as in these sentences, right? Several of you mentioned that they have to do, the commonality amongst them is to do with change. Victorino mentioned the metaphorical words, which is kind of where we're getting at, right? And they are there, right? These metaphors pervade our lives. They are really everywhere. So if we move on to the next slide, I wanted to share with you a little quick idea, right? The idea that these metaphors matter, right? We can't run away from them, and they shape the very reality that is out there because they affect how we perceive that reality, and they then affect how we take action about that reality. So if we move on to the next slide, there's a little latency in the video, but I'm in the slides, but I think we should be okay. Can we move on to the next slide, please? All right, let's give the team a little time to sort that out because I'm not seeing the next slide yet. Yeah, here we go. Excellent. Thanks very much to the team. So some of these metaphors, as I said, are everywhere. but they can also be quite subtle, right? We may not even notice them because we're so familiar with the metaphors that we don't even realize that they are there, shaping our thinking in subtle and quiet, small ways. We say we wake up, but we fall asleep. Now, why is it that waking is about moving upwards, but going to sleep is moving downwards? Interesting, right? Why have we chosen that? We could easily, from 100 years ago, have said that we sleep up, right, but fall awake. And then there would have been nothing wrong with that if we had become familiar with that as a metaphor. We say we couldn't get an idea across to people. Now that is dealing with ideas as a space, right? That it moves across the space from you to another person. And ideas are not spatial. Ideas are conceptual things. They exist in our heads, but they don't always work, in a way that is terrestrial, right? That involves a physical space. And yet we talk about these ideas getting across to people as if they are physical things. Then we say things like a message was buried in dense prose, as if prose is like soil somehow, right? And you're burying ideas into it. So we speak in metaphors all the time, right? When we look at ancient history, we've got examples. More modern history, we have examples like Southeast Asia doesn't need another Vietnam. Nowadays, people are saying the US does not need another Afghanistan, right? Those are situations where Vietnam and Afghanistan have become metaphors for the larger concept of long, protracted wars that have no clear sign of winners and that drain the resources, right? And also the political capital of a country like the US. Then we say we haven't covered much ground, as if covering ground is a physical thing again, even when we talk about ideas that are otherwise quite conceptual and quite vertical. And it's interesting here we say, right, can you examine an idea more deeply, as if depth is the way in which we measure a particular quality of an idea, rather than supposing that there may be other ways to look at it, right? That an idea might be rich, it might be wide, you might want to examine the breadth of how something spans. All of these could work there, right? And metaphors, therefore, are very, very subtle. They're not easy to spot, but they are there. In fact, I would go so far as to say that, as we see in the next slide, that metaphors are actually all around us, right? We can't really run away from them. This is going to date me greatly, right? This is from this wonderful movie, The Sixth Sense, which some of you will recognize and some of you will not, because you will feel that you're from a different era. But there's this wonderful line in the show, right, where this child says, "I see dead people, they're everywhere." And if you haven't watched it yet, it's a great film. I won't spoil it for you. But I think, like the dead people in The Sixth Sense, metaphors matter, right? And they are everywhere. We don't even realize quite how pervasive they are, but they truly are everywhere, as I've tried to illustrate in the previous few sets of sentences. So let's move on now to how we can apply this idea to the situation in healthcare today, right? These metaphors are going to shape how we perceive health itself, healthcare as a phenomenon, and of course, all of your work as health and healthcare professionals. Now, you may be wondering why I put the word healthcare in brackets there, because even there, I think the choice of language matters. If you're a healthcare professional, then your job is to deliver healthcare. If you're a health professional, then your job is to deliver health, right? Or help people achieve health in their situations. And it's particularly interesting, as for me as an economist by training, if you try and deliver healthcare, then you will create structures that are optimized to deliver that healthcare, to deliver the programs and policies and events that are about the healthcare that people might need to receive. The final result, whether they're healthy or not, may not actually get measured because you're focused on the healthcare rather than the health specifically. But if you think of yourself as a health professional, then suddenly that changes, right? The healthcare is just a means to that larger end of achieving the health of a population, or the health of an individual, or the health of a patient. And I think it's important, therefore, that even in this basic set of ideas, right, the choice of language, the metaphor that we use, becomes critically important because it affects the priorities and it affects the ways in which we approach the world that we are dealing with. So let me take you through some examples where I think the different metaphors can actually shape the work that we do in quite fundamental ways. Let's move to the next slide. I think there are three levels that matter in the work that we're trying to do, right? We have, at the most outermost level, the system that we all operate in, right? What is that system? Who is interacting within that system? Then we've got the issue of structure, right? What are the structures within that system? The organizations, the teams, the interagency teams possibly, but the teams within an organization that might be functioning to achieve a set of aims. Those are all structures that we have in place, the rules, the norms that we also have. And then finally, we have the selves, right? Each of us as an individual. Our metaphor for ourselves becomes important as well, because depending on how we frame that, we will have very different choices that we make in terms of the overall decisions that might actually have very consequential impacts on overall health and healthcare outcomes. So let me take you through these three levels and explain a little bit about what I mean by this. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, here we go. So we've got, we were fine just now. Yep, that's right, metaphors. Let's look at some metaphors for the system, right? The overall system that we're operating in and what exactly is going on there. Now, we could think of our system as a machine, right? A machine with cogs that interoperate within it and that functions according to the use of very specific mechanical rules, right? With a machine, you know that if you press a certain button, a certain consequence is going to happen. Our computers are machines. You press the on button, something is supposed to happen. When the computer is tired, you turn the computer off, it rests, it gets better after that. That's all treating the system as a machine, right? But it's important for us to remember that machines don't describe everything that we do in complete terms, because there are many things about what you are going through, especially in the human systems that you're dealing with in health and healthcare, that is not mechanical, right? People are not cogs in machines. We are not simply automated creatures. There are many things that are human about this, that where relationships matter, not just the mechanical interdependencies between different parts of a machine. So I think it's important to think about the system as a community as well, right? A group of people, as you can see on this slide, right? People gathering in connection with each other, even distanced communities, right? Communities that have to self-isolate are communities because there are still connections between the people that they have to explore. And then even more important, I think we can think about systems as a moral ecology, right? An ecology because we're not just a community of disparate individuals, right? We're not just groups put together where we don't have connections with each other. We are a moral ecology because everything we do affects other people. Every choice we make has impact on those around us, right? Most obviously on our immediate families, but it also has effect on our neighbors. It has effects on our people around us, the people in our teams, the people in our organizations. And I describe this as a moral ecology because it's not just a biological ecology, right? A biological ecology is like the one you see in the diagram here, right? The predator eats the prey eats smaller prey, the smallest prey eats plants, and then there is a food chain of some kind. But actually, in real life, our relationships are not just physical, biological relationships, they are moral relationships where each thing that we do has important impacts and consequences and ramifications for those around us. So I think when we think of the system, we need to move away from pure machine-like metaphors and start understanding that actually what we're operating in is a community and a moral ecology in much more real terms. So if we take that as the base, right, if this is the world that we are operating in, let's move to the next slide where we ask ourselves, in these three types of system, what exactly will we be seeing in terms of the structure of our work? If the system is a machine, then what will happen is that work will be seen as output, right? Machines have input, they do something in terms of their processes, then we go and have output from that, right? All machines do that. Computers have output. The machines that you see in this diagram here have output. The machines in factories will have output. And if work is only output, right? The structure of our work is such that we will start to treat it as, a fairly mechanical thing. We will work on it in terms of performance metrics that we need to deliver. And we will focus on the tangible, concretely measurable aspects of that output, rather than trying to realize that actually there are other aspects here, which the machine metaphor is not sufficient to describe. Because in a system as a community, then work is much more than just output. Work is also capital and social capital, right? It is capital because work is an investment for the future. You're investing in today's healthcare so that it affects the people there tomorrow. And you're investing in this healthcare of specific people and the health of specific people because there are larger externalities that affect those around them as well. And that's what I mean by social capital, right? That there is some kind of larger impact for the society and the community that we live in from the work that we do. And even that, I think, is not quite enough, because if you think of then the system of as a moral ecology, right, not just as a community of individuals, then we start to realize that work is all about interdependence, right? Work is interdependence because each thing that we do affects others, potentially beyond the healthcare system as well. I mean, we see this actually in the simplest of examples, right? If you're doing something like surgery, then you have got someone like the person in charge of anesthesia, the person in charge of watching what happens with certain basic bodily functions. You've got the person performing the surgery. You might have other observers looking at different aspects of what's going on. And all of that is a complex interdependence. When you place that within a larger system, like a hospital, then you start to realize that there are interdependencies between the different divisions in a hospital, or different divisions, or different interdependencies between the between one hospital and another, right? Especially in situations like COVID, because we find that everyone's specific actions have impact on what other people are doing and the kind of freedom to maneuver that they might have. So when we realize that work is interdependence, right, it's not just static output, then what we realize is work has significance across space, as we see with the social capital example, and it has significance across time, because the interdependence is actually where we start to see that what we do today affects potential consequences tomorrow, right? Not just in the everyday atmosphere of the current time frame, but actually the effects that are felt much more in the long term. So if all this is true, right, if the system can be seen as machine, community, and moral ecology, and that means that our work can be seen in many different ways as output, social capital, and interdependence, then what does that mean for us, right, as individuals in that overall system? Does that mean that we are powerless, or does that mean that we actually have agency and a certain amount of control that we can exercise over the systems that we're in? So this is where the next slide becomes relevant. So if we can move to that next slide, please. It's probably one of the last substance slides that I wanted to look at. Just move quickly. I know there's some of us are experiencing more of a lag than others. So we'll get there quickly. Yeah, here we go. So the system as a machine, right? If we think about what we are in that case, is that we're cogs in the machine, right? And that can be a very useful metaphor, because it helps us to figure out how we are most efficient and how we can interact best with others. It gives us clear roles so that we can play those roles and make sure that we optimize the outcomes at the system level. But I don't think it's enough, right? I'm not sure about you, but I wouldn't like to be described as a cog in a machine. I think when we think of systems as communities, then we're looking at ourselves as stakeholders, right? People who matter in that community and whose decisions actually affect that larger community as well. So I think that's an important way of thinking about it as well, right? And the minute we start thinking of ourselves as stakeholders, we have a much more empowered attitude to the work that we are doing, right? We're not just here receiving rules and instructions from the people around us. We are stakeholders. We have choices that we make which can affect, in very positive or negative ways, what's going on in the world. And then even more powerfully, in a system as a moral ecology, right, where work is interdependence, then we start to become not just stakeholders today, but we become stewards for the future as well, right? We are holding a current ecology in trust, making sure that we keep it in as much balance as possible before we take it into the future and make sure that the outcomes for that future are also optimized in the best possible way. So I think these are quite critical ways of observing this, because even if we stop at the stakeholder level, right, and we don't bring in the dynamic interactions of different timeframes, I think we have a limiting factor on how we approach things like healthcare, right? If we start to see ourselves though as stakeholders and stewards, then I think the approach that we have will be very different. Because here I've talked about us, right, as health professionals, or all of you, how you view the self of the patient will also become important. If the patient is just a cog in a machine, that's not going to be very useful, right? Because they will be disempowered entities, not able to take on, agency for themselves. But if patients are seen as stakeholders and potential stewards of their own lives, then we can have them take ownership over the process of healthcare provision and for their own health as well. I was just joking with the organizers earlier that while I've been in SHN and this cough suddenly came up, I had certain choices, right? I could have sat here and just been sad about it and not able to get any medicine because I can't get out of the building. But then, of course, there's now this wonderful empowerment that various apps allow us to have. And I was uttering many silent prayers of gratitude for MOH and its allowance of the Doctor Anywhere app, because I did a call there. I had a 10-minute chat with a really nice GP who found out what was going on. I told him what was the matter. And he then said, all right, I'll send you the following things. What else do you need? I told him any other symptoms that I might have had. And then in an hour and a half, my medicine arrives, right? And I can take it and start the process of recovery. And that for me is about the patient, in my case, me, right? Acting as a stakeholder, acting as a steward, and not just simply functioning as a cog in a machine that has no power, no agency, no control over what it does. And I think we are moving in wonderful directions in this aspect of healthcare. We need to keep up that movement, because the more we can see that stakeholders and stewards matter, the more I think our healthcare system becomes more nuanced and becomes more sophisticated in its overall operation. Let me move now to the final slide, which I wanted to share with you, just in terms of how this affects what we think about, right? And how we think about the work that we do. Right? How do we live out these new metaphors? The first thing is that I don't want you to run away thinking that the machine metaphor is not useful. It is. It's very powerful, but we need to remember that the mechanization and the automation that are part of machines serve people, not the other way around. Right? If we let the machine become the be-all and end-all of what's happening in our lives, then I think we lose many of the more human aspects, the relational aspects of healthcare. And so we need to remember that the mechanization is useful. It's actually a very useful efficiency tool, but it must serve people rather than somehow or other, be the be-all and end-all of the whole system. The second idea that's for me really important is that relationships matter. Why do I say this? Because if we are a community, and in many ways we are that, right? There are healthcare communities, you and your patients form communities of relationships. If we are stakeholders, then we need to realize that the relationships matter as much as the mechanical and technical aspects of how we function. This means that the equipment of hospitals matters just as much as the ways in which people relate to others, right? I know the doctors amongst you, the nurses amongst you will all understand what bedside manner is. Super critical, right? If that isn't there, the best equipment in the world is not going to help you, right? I'm a huge fan at the moment of two Netflix series, both New Amsterdam and The Good Doctor, mainly because my parents have been watching it. And so every time I come down from a work meeting while working from home, they'll be watching an episode of it. And so I've been slowly drawn into these worlds of how hospitals function. And what I've noticed particularly, and I suppose this is partly the nature of Hollywood drama, right, is that the relationships matter, right, just as much as any technical aspects that are out there. And then finally, let me talk a little bit about stewardship, right? Because if we are stewards, then actually we're holding things in trust. We don't own anything at all. All we can do, I think, is function in terms of the holding of something in trust for a few years. And then when we hand it over, either because we change jobs or we move to another agency or we move to another place where you alter your practice, then that trust is given up to someone else, right? And I think the more of us who can exercise that kind of leadership as trust sort of role, the more we will find that we design systems that are resilient across time. Because if we're only optimizing for ourselves, there's a problem, I think. There's a certain selfishness, there's a certain vertical quality, and a limitedness about the way in which we operate. But if we recognize that stewards actually optimize across time, then I think we'll get much better outcomes in the end, because we'll be keeping the humanness and the dynamic interaction amongst people in mind for the overall design of the systems that we operate in. So this was my last slide. I wanted to just talk about how we actually live this out, right? Rather than just keep the metaphors as conceptual ideas. And I'm looking forward very much to the Q&A now. So I'll hand you back to David, and we can see where the Q&A and discussion takes us. Thanks very much.
Okay, Aaron, you have questions coming in fast and furious. Yeah, to connect with your last two slides, right? The healthcare community preference, if you look at personality preference, taking a leaf from Carl Jung's work, is very ST, sensing, logical, very much a machine paradigm, automation, information technology, robotics, as opposed to possibilities, values paradigm. You spoke about ecology. leaders within our ecosystem gravitate towards a data-centric today approach as opposed to exploring using metaphors for possible futures. Um, it has been like that for the longest time. What advice or suggestions would you have for us to move forward?
That's a really powerful question, David. And it's interesting that you mentioned the ST dominance of who you have in healthcare. I suppose that's why you invited an NF to share some thoughts with you today, just to make sure there's complementarity. I'm pretty willing to bet that Melissa Kui is NF as well. I think I'm NFJ and I'm pretty sure she's NFP. So you've got a good range at work there. See, the thing about it is these binaries should not define us, I think, in either or ways. We need the S and the T functions, right? The world of data keeps us disciplined. The world of technology, I think, keeps us technically accurate in the work that we're trying to do. I think what we need to realize is Jung's work was all about not finding a dominance of one type, right? It was saying that we all have natural preferences, but within that, we can find wholeness as we get older. And so the S type slowly learned that the reason that the S stuff matters is partly because in each of the bits of data, there is a vast human story, right? There is a vast mystery, if you like, in a particular aspect. A blood cell, an individual eye, part that's being operated on, or an individual even, right? Their story is large and infinite. Just as I think an N, right? The N types must realize that sometimes the data actually matters because it helps us understand our intuitions and visions in much larger ways. And it helps us to actually make sense of what otherwise remains this very impressionistic idea that we can't fully articulate. And I feel this very strongly because as I get older, one of my hardest functions to develop, so as an INFJ, in Jungian terms, and in the Myers-Briggs kind of typology, my inferior function is extroverted sensing, right? So the function I use least, or only when I'm tired and depleted is extroverted sensing. And so the question for me is, how do I use my sensing function in a way that allows me to control it rather than have it control me, right? And I think that's the key to all of this work, right? That we need to know what we are less good at and realize that just because we don't prefer it, the system might still actually need it. And then the job of us is to do a few things, right? One is to coach ourselves and acquire at least a functional literacy in the other in the other ways of perceiving the world that may not be obvious to us. But even more importantly, we need to hire diversely. If you have a dominantly ST team or dominantly introvert team, then I would say to a lot of my directors, go make sure you hire some NFs, right? Go make sure you hire some E's and I's to complement what you already have. And I think that's going to be quite critical, right? If we can hire for diversity rather than hiring in our own image, then I think we'll have a much greater range of views that can be used to broaden the range of metaphors. Because it's not just that only N's and F's have a view on metaphors, right? STs have metaphors too. And we need to find ways for those metaphors to commingle and mix with each other in ways that are as rich as possible, rather than assuming that any single metaphor somehow has to dominate. Because what I hope has come from my talk is that no single metaphor will ever have all the answers to a problem that we're facing. And we need a mix of metaphors to actually function as well as possible.
Thank you, Aaron. I do hope my human resources is listening in. Yeah, so please hire for diversity. Yeah. Okay. Where you left off, language and framing. Now, really for us, many of us in healthcare, it's not a forte for us. Is there a pragmatic way for leaders to workshop metaphors that we can effectively use so that it ends up as pertinent, sensitive, engaging, instead of being misguided?
That's a great idea. I like the idea of workshopping in particular. And the thing is, we have structures for this already. I presume that many of our teams, right, will go through things like retreats or, annual sessions where you have discussions about where you'd like to go next, right? And the problem with a lot of those discussions is they often focus on the what and the how, right? The plans that we make are always about how we organize ourselves, what new actions must we take. If we're very daring, we might ask, what do we stop doing? But we don't get much beyond that. And I actually think one important question to ask in a retreat type setting is, how do we think of ourselves? What are we? right? And then once we have that idea, right, what is that metaphor that undergirds the visualization of ourselves? Then I think we'll be able to say from that metaphor, we have certain ramifications. There's two books that I would strongly suggest people read if they're interested in using metaphorical thinking in a more sophisticated way. The first is a book called Metaphors We Live By. Wonderful collection of ideas and essays, actually, which actually gets across, I think, quite how pervasive the idea of the metaphor is. And once people have that, once you see in metaphors, you can't unsee it, right? It's like one of those processes that's irreversible in the expansion of the range of vision. So Metaphors We Live By is an important one. The other is a book by Gareth Morgan called Images of Organization. And what he does there is he takes the idea of metaphors and applies it to organizations. And he asks, what do we think of our organizations as? Are they machines? So he uses the machine metaphor. Are they cultures? Are they families with all their functions and dysfunctions? Are they psychic prisons? I think is one other idea that he's got there, and in a few other thoughts, right? And when you have those sorts of ways of perceiving, then you can really ask yourself, which of these matter most, right, to us? And the funny thing is, right, we think that the machine metaphor is the most obvious, but many of us, especially when you're doing things like, OD type work or HR, our natural metaphor might end up being the family. How many times have we received an email that says, "Dear XYZ family," right? Where XYZ might be the name of a hospital, or "Dear MOH," or "Dear CHI family." We talk about that all the time, right? And so we use the family metaphor quite extensively, actually. And I think all we need to do is name this process clearly and say we need to come up with better metaphors for ourselves, and then use the wisdom of the crowd that's in that room, right, during a retreat or a discussion on strategic planning to actually come up with a different set of metaphors. And it's hard. It is true, David, that the ST types will find it a bit harder, but that's okay, because the metaphors that they come up with will be very useful nonetheless, right? They will come up with, I think, metaphors around engineering or ecology, which we don't want to lose. We just want to make sure that we marry them with the human-related metaphors that I think also need to matter in the work that we do.
Thanks, Aaron. That's very helpful. There's a question on stewardship from Tak Ming. How should organizations deal with the concept of stewardship in terms of innovation where individual ownership and drive is important?
I'd be curious to hear from Tak Ming why he feels that individual ownership and drive is so important, actually. I guess we make that assumption sometimes because we want to feel that accountability is important, right? And we want to make sure that, I mean, in the negative sense, it's basically, okay, if something happens, whose head is going to roll for something, right? And if something good happens, then who will we give credit to? There's nothing wrong with that broad idea. But what I would say is that stewardship is particularly important when the issues we're dealing with are so complex that individual attribution of credit or blame cannot be done simply. And I think increasingly in today's day and age, right, in so much of what we do, it is collective responsibility that matters. I look around and my grandmother recently got vaccinated, and she's not able to walk. So she's very much at home all the time. And I have an older uncle, my dad's brother, who has been mentally retarded since he was 1, since he had meningitis. And so both of them needed their vaccinations at home. And I bring this up because there was a small team that came over to do the vaccination, right? And that might look like it's an individual role that they're playing. But I also know that they are part of a much larger collective, right? An ecology, a swarm, if you like, of people going out and doing this work. And each of us has an individual role, but we're doing it as part of a larger aim, right? And I think we need to remember that actually there are going to be both individual as well as organizational accountabilities that need to be put in place. And once we remember that the group has accountability as well, then I think it becomes a lot easier to envision stewardship as a way of thinking, rather than assuming that every individual has to kind of fend for themselves. Because I think that's very dangerous, actually. What we end up with, if we take that to its logical extreme, is highly atomized individuals, right, who don't see what they are doing as part of a larger functionality. Yeah, so that would be my response to that question, which is that individual accountability does matter, but we need to realize that many of the accountabilities in complex situations are much more team-based. And that's why increasingly in certain teams, you will have team level bonuses and not just individual level bonuses, right? Because you want to make sure that the incentives are structured that way. I would also add that you don't want only team level bonuses. If everybody tries to be a steward and forgets that they are individually accountable for things, then you end up with free ridership problems. And you therefore need a balance, I think, between those two different ways of operating.
It's something we have been talking about for the last 5 years. It's a struggle when we talk about performance management, right? So how do I recognize individual contribution while acknowledging that it was part of a team effort?
That's right.
So that's always a challenge. Just to get a little bit deeper into this thing about normals and new normals. So in Singapore, everybody talks about the new normal. It sounds like a moving goalpost. Some may find or feel that this is quite unattainable. What's your take on painting and articulating the parameters more clearly, moving more towards machine than towards ecology? Yeah, so that people become comfortable thinking of the new normal as something more fluid.
Yeah, and again, the name that we use actually matters, right? I don't like new normal, to be honest, because it suggests that we move from one stable equilibrium to another stable equilibrium, right? And I personally think that that's not the way we're going to go. Perhaps this is the job hazard of doing a lot of planning, right, in my career. But I actually think that the better phrase here is the never normal, right? Someone else came up with a different one. They said they didn't like new normal because it was too stable. So they called it the next normal, to suggest that there's one normal after another, and we just have to get used to the fact that we're in a series of normals. That's better than new normal, but I think that's still problematic because it assumes that there's kind of a step function in normality, and you move from one thing to another to another. My personal view is that we're already in a never normal, that the world is much too unstable, partly because of very large macro forces like climate change, but also because of other political and social forces, right, that are fragmenting societies quite significantly, things like identity politics. And when you put those together, what you end up with is situations where the trends just simply are not linear. And so I think the idea of any normal is not actually that useful. Whereas in a never normal, what we have to do is plan for resiliency. We have to make sure that we set in place enough optionality to adjust to new situations. We have to make sure that we are able to adapt. And we have to make sure that we keep learning so that as the never normal evolves, we are also evolving. Even if we can't keep pace with it, hopefully we can at least be a couple of steps behind and not too far. And I think that's very important. The never normal becomes a new way of thinking about the situations that we're in. I've titled several other talks, the never normal, right? And so I suppose the implicit idea of that is very much here, even in the idea of community and of ecology, because I don't think we've used those dynamic ideas quite as much as we could have.
You talk about the never normal, that's new to me. And my colleagues in the room were all looking perplexed with this new term, never normal. If you recall in the 70s, right, there was this movement, stop at 2. Of course, my parents decided not to stop at 2, so I have 5 brothers. Right. And each time they went to the maternity ward, they were counseled. You cannot have another child. And we can see the repercussions today. Do you think that we are unable to comprehend this never normal because of the way the paradigms that we were exposed to as a society and as a people?
I think it's quite normal in human nature to crave a certain amount of stability. That doesn't make us bad people, it makes us human. So we tend to like, I think, structures that are stable, that have clear outcomes, and where there's a kind of an effort-output ratio that vaguely makes sense. Like I put in twice as much effort and I get maybe twice as much, maybe 4 times as much result. There's a proportionality in that, right? It's very Cartesian thinking. It goes back to the idea that there's a linearity in the world, and that if X happens, Y must happen as well, and there's a kind of reasonable process that connects them. But actually, the world has not always been linear, right? There's always been logarithms and exponents out there that where the world functions in very different ways, and the relationships don't work in these neat linear fashions. Some of this goes back to your ST characterization again. STs love what some people would call the audit space, right? The space of clear outcomes, clear cause and effect. And there's a lot there that's super important, right? Many things that we do in government, in healthcare are like that. You want to have fixed rules about how to manage anesthesia, how to manage blood pressure, right? And certain procedures that you follow in things like surgery. But the procedures are there, I think, precisely so that when there are exceptions, we can adjust to those exceptions rather than have to think on the spot, right? And create everything from scratch. But I do think that we need to get more used to the fact that there is an unordered space out there as well, right? A space where the cause and effect relationships are not obvious. They might be there, but they're not obvious. And we need to go hunt them down, therefore. And even when we find them, we might find that they're characterized by simple but non-linear rules rather than a simple linearity of function. And the more we can get to that, actually, the more we realize that a truly healthy organization, right, is one that toggles between, you know, the stability of the normal and the instability of the never normal, and then tries to work out a balance between them. As I've said to my teams at MCI before, right, when it comes to doing claims, I don't want you all to be creative, right? Don't go and invent your own rules, because there's a reason why processes exist. But then when we're trying to figure out how to deal with disinformation and fake news, where there are no established patterns, that's where we need, you know, this more customization, I think, to the never normal to actually start to come about. Because if we don't have that and we try to apply the ordered rules to the unordered space or vice versa, that's when we end up with real problems, I think. So the more of us can discern which space we're actually operating in, the more sophisticated our outcomes can become, I think.
Thank you for gifting us with this new term, never normal. Okay, I need to read this. Let me read this one to you. I think it's a very interesting question from Edwin. Hi, Aaron. Do you think the use of some metaphors will evolve dramatically with time and global developments? Example, viral is usually seen as negative, associated with the spread of viruses. But in the internet space, viral can mean a rapid perpetuation of both good and bad information.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Edwin, for that. And I agree. I do think metaphors will evolve with time. And as more things enter our normal vocabulary, the more we'll be able to have an expansive vision, I think, for what exactly those different metaphors can do. Viral is a great example, actually, you know, because and actually all metaphors will have positive and negative aspects to them if we can think about them in a deep enough way. I think there was a question from Khalid as well, you know, about whether there is a negative side to using metaphors. And there definitely is, because all metaphors illuminate certain things, right? The machine metaphor illuminates certain established cause and effect relationships, but it obscures the human aspects of things, right? The community metaphor might overemphasize the human relationships and ignore the fact that there are actually some stable rules and norms that govern the interaction that people can have. So there are always going to be things that metaphors light up and things that they darken, right? There'll be things that they illuminate and things that they enshadow. So we need to be able to be very discerning about what exactly those metaphors are like. So even with viral, right, we need to realize that it's going to illuminate the speed, right, for better and for worse. But it might ignore certain other things, which is that, you know, I mean, viruses sometimes can spread linearly, sometimes they can spread much faster. We need to be able to capture the speed and the extent of that spread as well, right? When does it slow down? When does it speed up? And that may not be directly applicable or not directly applicable to different situations, because there's a different degree, I think, of virality and velocity at work. This links a bit to Prakash's question as well, actually, about metaphors for COVID-19. Thanks, Prakash, for the question and for your concern about the hoarse throat. Always appreciate hearing a question from a good friend. And he asked about questions from metaphors for COVID-19, right? That I think will illustrate a nice aspect of what Edwin and Khalid also asked about, because my own thinking is that there are many ways we could have viewed COVID-19. In a TED talk that I did last year, I actually talked about 3 different metaphors, right? There's a war metaphor that you can use in COVID, the war on COVID. People have actually talked about that. And when we talk about things like defeat the virus, let's flatten the curve, those are all metaphors of war, right? It's martial language. Even the idea of a quarantine, when you think about it, when do you have quarantines? You have quarantines in epidemics and during wars, right? People have to stay at home at a certain time. So very, very military language. Nothing wrong with that, right? It captures the urgency in what's going on. It captures the fact that we do need people to kind of knuckle down and listen to a hierarchy of relationships, because some of us have more information than others, and out of a desire for welfare, we want people to therefore do things like stay at home. So I think the war metaphor is useful, but it's incomplete because who is the enemy here? COVID's not the enemy, it's a natural phenomenon, right? And if COVID is the enemy, then when do we end this war? Is an endemic war the same then as Afghanistan and Vietnam, where you just have constant guerrilla fighting? So I think the war metaphor has limitations. My personal favorite is something that we use today as well, right? The idea of an ecology. COVID is part of an ecology, as are we, and we need to find ways to dynamically live with it as it must learn to live with us, right? And how do we do that? We adjust our rules, right? We get used to the fact that when we travel to Estonia for a 5-day trip, it's actually a 14-day commitment because we're going to come back and spend time in a hotel and not see human beings for a good 7 days, which for an introvert like me is fine, right? I'm kind of rebuilding all my energy as we go along. But we change the norms of travel, right? We get on planes and we realize that we keep our masks on. That's different practice from what we might have had before. We may greet people differently. We may have events that are not 500 people, but 100 people so that we maintain some level of safe distancing. So the norms can change because the ecology is evolving, right? And for me, the ecology metaphor does more for us in terms of our COVID-19 efforts, because it helps us to capture both the human aspects and the complex interdependencies amongst the different players. So that then helps to answer Edwin's question as well, I think, right? Which is that, we may have thought about war metaphors a while ago, but I think ecology metaphors are becoming much clearer and more useful to us now, precisely because we have to deal with the fact that there are so many, both moral as well as physical interdependencies amongst our different communities.
Yeah, it reminds me of the war on diabetes.
Yeah.
If you recall, and all the conversations that came up, it was very military sounding, even within the hospital. And when we talked about it as a behavioral thing, the entire conversation changed.
Exactly. That's right. Because the metaphor, the lens that you use, has given you a new way of perceiving the overall problem. Yeah. And maybe even not see it as a problem anymore, right? I mean, it is a fact, and then you can figure out, all right, where's the assets here and where are the gaps? And then you figure out both of those things. Yeah. That's
right. Actually, you don't need moderation, Aaron. You just went on.
No, you go ahead, pick the questions. Yeah.
Okay. There's this other question. You spoke about the future, right? And the never normal. And we are talking about change. Yeah. So what has been the greatest challenge in coping with the change mindset? And what's your take on how Singaporeans or the global community have adapted to this change?
Are we talking specifically COVID-19 here or just change in general?
COVID-19.
Right. Interesting question. The first thing I would say is that change is never comfortable, right? Change always involves friction and transformation from us. And that means abandoning what is familiar, abandoning what is comfortable, and kind of dealing with the new frictions of coming up with new capabilities as well as new responses. I remember at the start of COVID-19, I literally felt like I had 3 jobs. I had the core job I was asked to do at MCI. And then there was new work that was coming out because of COVID, including things like, oh my God, there's going to be a circuit breaker at some point. Can we make sure that everybody's internet is not going to die, right? Because can you imagine if we're all stuck at home and the internet isn't working, kids can't do HBL, parents can't run away from kids doing HBL by watching Netflix and things like that. Or parents can't make the kids run away from their HBL by watching Netflix or Apple TV or whatever it was. And so there was a lot of work that IMDA was doing on that front, just making sure that there was resilience of supply. And then there was also a new type of work in terms of how do we repurpose our organization for the needs of COVID, and that's ongoing for all of us, right? We are trying to decide how often we should test all of ourselves, right? And do we do it together? Do we do it at home and then declare the results on an app? All these things are the third aspect of the job, right? Which is the new things about the organization that we need to deal with. And the thing that we forget easily, I think, is that dealing with that kind of change takes a huge amount of time and bandwidth and energy. And that's why we often avoid these issues if we can help it. But when we do it, we need to find ways to also, I think, create opportunities for self-care. Because if we just try and do all that new work while doing the old work, then we start to realize that we're basically depleting ourselves quite significantly by the end of that whole process. And I think we need to get kinder so that we actually give ourselves opportunities to rest, deprioritize certain areas of work if necessary, and then give ourselves the capacity to make the transformations again. One of the first things we discussed at MCI coming out of the circuit breaker was, can we redo our work plans? Because we all had work plans, but they were work plans designed pre-COVID. So our PS, who's wonderfully visionary in a lot of ways and was PS Health at one point, she actually said, let's revise all of this, right? I'll give you all license, go and look at your work plans, tell me what you want to keep and what you can now abandon and what new things you now have to do. And I think that made for a much saner discussion once she gave us the space to recognize that there was change happening here and change would take effort and bandwidth and energy on all our parts to actually navigate it.
Is there a question that should have been asked but was not? I'm sure when you prepared for this session, you had some thoughts in your mind.
I would have loved to hear a question about our own mental and overall personal wellness and welfare, actually, because what I'm asking for in this presentation, right, is very demanding, right? I'm asking for people to be able to toggle between ways of being that are not easy to do, right? And as you mentioned, right, if you're an ST type, that's going to shape kind of how you are. And without conscious growth and support, you're not going to be able to make that transformation to see other ways of operating. And so I am asking for quite demanding things. I'm aware of it, right? But I've always been told that I'm a bit of a work creator, so I suppose I have to embrace that where I can. I do think it's important to remember that we need to most fundamentally actually take care of ourselves. And this goes back to the metaphor that we have as well, right? If we see ourselves as machines, if the self is a machine or a cog in a machine, then it doesn't need much maintenance, right? I mean, maybe you need to polish the cog every now and then, make sure it doesn't go through wear and tear. And even there's some care that goes on, but not huge. But when you remember that you're a person among persons, and that we are all filled not just with physical needs, but with emotional and psychological needs as well, then I think that space for mental health becomes so much more important than it might have been before. I'm so glad actually that there's more discussion happening about this now in many different parts of Singapore, right? In organizations, at the national level, there's many more task forces that are looking at how we cater to the mental health of different groups. MOE is paying much more attention to it in schools. The universities are paying attention. I think that's important as well, because I don't want to run away with the idea that, oh, this crazy poet is here telling people that they must learn to see through different metaphors, but forgetting that it takes a huge amount of effort and bandwidth and energy. So I think the mental health and the self-care part of this is super important. In some of the work I've done internationally, in leadership summits and when I've attended various events, one of the most common themes that we hear about is burnout on the one hand, right, by people in leadership capacities. And on the other hand, people telling you, you are your greatest asset. And if you don't take care of that asset, then everything else you do, which is derivative from that asset, will never get realized. This links actually to, I think there was a question from Jeff Ong, right, who asked a bit about control versus coexistence and compassion. It's not a direct response, but I think the idea of compassion has to start with ourselves, right? If we don't want to just exert control over others, and because we realize that they are not just beings to be controlled, right? They are beings who are autonomous and have agency, then we must, I think, realize that the compassion must start with ourselves. Because once we do that, then we are able to understand the complexity and the range and the depth of this other human being that we are dealing with. And I think when you approach each other that way, then you can, I think, do much more justice to the range and diversity that could actually come about because that person is human at heart.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. I'm looking at time. We are 1 minute away from 1 o'clock. We've been speaking about metaphors for the last 1 hour. Any famous last words for us?
That's a good, wow, that's tough.
Yeah, this is going to come back and bite you one day.
Yes, it probably will. It probably will. No, I think we've covered a lot of the most important ground already. I think the basic thing I would say is, after today, if people can just go away and be more aware of what their instinctive metaphor is, right? in how they see the world, how they see their family, how they see the teams that they are in, how they see their organization. Really to ask, what is that, right? Is it, do you see it as a family? Do you see it as a machine? And don't be shy about it, but then acknowledge what that metaphor doesn't help you see as well, right? And maybe say, I want to have 3 metaphors that are going to together capture much more of the complexity. I think even a little bit of reflection like that could be very, very powerful, because it will help take us to a much more nuanced, much richer understanding of things. It will also, I think, help us to measure better. If you don't mind, David, there was actually a question from Clive, another very dear friend. Clive, thanks for the question about measurement, right? How do we measure that, the non-tangible, the non-concrete aspects here? And I think that's super key, right? Because the ST types in our organization are always going to want measurements. I remember having a big fight with my own DS when I was in PSD, because I was doing strategy and strat planning at the time. And she came up to me and said, Aaron, your KPIs for your team are all non-specific and non-timely. And I was like, yeah, but my work is non-specific and non-timely. So I don't know what you want me to do. Like my KPI is, let's not make bad decisions. That's what strategy is meant to do for us, right? And then she kind of laughed and said, okay, I understand, but I need something timely and specific as well. So in the end, what we did was we narrowed things down to number of workshops we conducted, number of projects that we do, and then we captured the qualitative aspects in kind of a remarks column. So the numbers column made her happy, the qualitative aspects made me happy, and it was all great after that. And that's my answer to Clive as well, right? When we understand our own metaphors, right, and reflect on them, we are much more able to capture both the data, the numerical and concrete material, but we also need to learn to capture stories, because many aspects of the stewardship and so community metaphors that I described will not get captured in individual pieces of data, but in the anec data, right? The stories that get created when the data comes together. So we need to learn that stories are data too, right? I did my whole PhD using qualitative methods, and qualitative methods basically tell us that the non-numerical matters a great deal as well. And if we can bring those two together, right, the numerical, the quantitative, as well as the qualitative, how much more powerful our insights are going to be. So that would be my parting shot, David. Know our own metaphors and then measure the things based on those metaphors.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I know that all of us greatly enjoyed this 1 hour. I do know a lot of my colleagues skipped lunch and they're going to go back into clinical work right after this. So thank you for providing this nourishment for all of us. That's a metaphor, by the way.
It is, absolutely. But please don't forget physical eating as well. We all need to do that too, right? So self-care, everybody. Please make sure you have time for at least a sandwich or a donut or something. Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron.
Donut, too much sugar.
War against diabetes, Aaron.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Charmaine, all yours.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you, Aaron. Truly an illuminating and enriching session. So before we wave everyone goodbye, we would just like to take a quick screenshot. All right. So my team here will be capturing. Big smile in 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. Thank you again. All right, we hope to see everyone soon. So audience on screen, we hope you have enjoyed today's session as much as we did. Before you go, don't forget to rate today's session using the Zoom polling function on your screen. And do drop us a comment via the survey that will appear on your screen after you exit the session. We look forward to seeing you again in the next CHI Innovate 2021 segment, where another of our CentreStage speaker, Ms. Melissa Kui, CEO of the National Volunteer and Philanthropy Center, will make her appearance on the 21st of October 2021. See you then.